neighborhood, and we are all asked to join them to help out. And the details are in our chapter newsletter, and I would assume on the chapter website as well. And the newsletter is also there on the website. And a second event on next Wednesday, April 28th at 7 o'clock, same time next week. Woodland restoration and spring wildflowers at the Turner Woodland. This is Mark and Brian Turner's and Natalie as well, the three of them that live at this location, the address on Wynn Road between Bellingham and Ferndale. And it's informal. I just come, there'll be guides to help you to the trails. It won't be a group meeting. It will be dispersed recreation. So there's no numbers limit. So both cases, as well as the work party on Saturday, come and work in the first case or enjoy the habitat in the next Wednesday. And I think that is the announcements that well, Jim Kling will be introducing our speaker, and there will be a question and answer session after the formal presentation. Following that, there will be some informal just chat, socializing, primarily for people in the Native Plant Society chapter here, but anyone is welcome to stick around and see what we've been seeing out there in our botanizing and such. Abe, would you like to say something? And the other people here on our panel, Abe Lloyd and Katrina Poppy and Jim Kling. And then at the Washington Native Plant Society, we'll see Denise Mankey, the state business manager, who will come in and check up on us occasionally. So, and Abe had something to say.
Yeah, news on the panel too. But I just wanted to invite everybody to vote for the poetry contest. The voting officially closed yesterday, but I'm going to tally the results tomorrow. So you can read the poems that were submitted for the Limerick contest as part of the Native Plant Appreciation Month on our chapter website. And they're really fun to read. So recommend reading them, and then send me your favorite three ranked. We'll do a ranked choice voting.
And if that's done tonight, you will be included in the tally.
Yeah.
Okay. Welcome, Anu. You're joining us. And okay, anything else to announce? So Jim, you could, yours.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, today we've got Thor Hanson. He's a biologist and author, local, and he's written a number of really good books, including Buzz, The Triumph of Seeds and Feathers, and The Impenetrable Forest, and has done a lot of work in media as well, including being on NPR's Fresh Air and Science Friday. And he was also co-host of American Spring Live a couple of years ago, which is a great PBS nature series I highly recommend. Thor's going to talk to us today about bees and seeds in your backyard. So any questions you have, please post them in the Q&A, and as Alan said, we'll answer those after the talk. Thanks. Take it away, Thor.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Jim, for that kind introduction, and thank you. Also, I want to give a shout out to Katrina, who was persistent in contacting me over a course of not just months but years to finally find a date where all of this would work. So I'm really glad to join all of you in this virtual setting. Of course, I'm sure we would all rather be in the same room, but that day will come soon, I hope. And in the meanwhile, we can thank the Zoom gods for giving us this virtual opportunity. I will be sharing the screen, showing some slides as we go along, but I am, a bit of a Zoom Luddite. Probably, it's safe to say I'm handier with a hand lens or a pair of binoculars than I am with a computer. So if I start to lag or anything like that, Jim is going to give me the heads up, and we will find a way to correct it. So bear with us through any glitches. Now, this evening's chosen topic is, of course, common backyard wonders. Bees and Seeds is going to draw on books that I've written on both of those topics. And as Jim mentioned, I've also written a book all about feathers. But if I were to include that this evening, then we would run the risk of a lecture about the birds and the bees and the flowers and the trees. And we didn't want to go down that path. So we're leaving the feathers out for the evening. But when we get to the question and answer period, should you have some burning feathery question that simply must be answered this evening, feel free. I'm happy to chat about anything at that time. Now, as a biologist and an author, I've spent a lot of time obviously focused on plants and animals and all of these things, but I also spend a lot of time thinking about people, more perhaps than you might expect. And that is because my goal and my hope with this work is not just to help people learn about nature, but help people to connect with it or reconnect with it, if you will. And to that end, I am particularly fascinated by these natural objects that transcend the imaginary, but nonetheless very significant barrier that we tend to put between the human world and the natural world. You know, things like bees and seeds, these common backyard wonders that we encounter daily, yet rarely stop to think about. But when we do take the time to pause, I always find that these common backyard happenings can be real touchstones to nature, telling us all sorts of fascinating stories about biology, about evolution, about the natural world, and about our connections to it. So what I want to do this evening then is to tell you several of those stories, starting with one about seeds. And I have to begin by saying that when I first began this seed project, the book project, my wife made an interesting observation. She said to me, you know, your topics keep getting smaller. And of course, I'd begun by writing a book about mountain gorillas, and then I'd written a book about feathers, and now here I was moving on to seeds, and it seemed as if dust motes might be the next option in the chain. But nonetheless, I have learned, if I've learned anything, I have learned that the size of a natural wonder has no bearing whatsoever upon its importance or upon the fascinating and remarkable stories that it has to tell. Consider, if you will, just one of the basic seed characteristics, the characteristic of endurance, the ability of a seed to persist in the soil, to lie dormant there for months, for years, even decades before sprouting. Now, we take it for granted that a packet of seeds can be stored for planting the next year. And we take it for granted that staple grains like wheat and corn and rice can be stored in granaries. They can be stored in warehouses. They can be shipped around the world. They can be stored in our pantries for months, even years, and still be fresh. Our farming and our food production systems really rely upon dormancy, this endurance characteristics, but it's still quite poorly understood. I mean, how is it possible, really, for a baby plant to lie in a state of what amounts to suspended animation and then suddenly to spring to life again when the time is just right? Now, experts still aren't sure on how this works, but they believe that it has to do with something called bioglass. We know now that truly dormant seeds are desiccated, that they lose 85, 90, even 95% of their water. They become truly, truly desiccated and dried out. And what's left inside those seeds, inside the individual cells, the nucleus and the various organelles, all the things that make a cell function, they become encased in this glass-like sugar-based substance that somehow preserves not only form and function, but a sense of arrangement. So that when the cell is once again flooded with water upon germination, all of those components of the cell don't just start working again. they retake the same positions that they had before the seed dried out. It's a truly remarkable way for those seeds to lie dormant and then come to life again. And people don't quite understand how this works, but they have a feeling it must have something to do with this bioglass state that they're in. So it's a remarkable thing. I do not recommend that you try this at home with your own cells. Animal cells aren't very good at this. Human cells don't do this. If you desiccate your own cells to such a degree, you get a mummy. So don't try it with your cells, but plants know how to do this very well, and seeds are the best example on the book. And even though we don't completely understand how it works, scientists have begun to use this, to copy this bioglass setting in other uses. We are all thinking a lot about vaccines these days. And in fact, the first dry vaccines available anywhere came to pass when scientists suspended measles vaccine into a sugar substance. And I had to write this down. It's called Myo-Inositol. Myo-Inositol. It is a natural sugar extracted from, well, no surprise, inside the seeds of various legumes, nuts, and even found in rice. And just like the seeds that inspired these vaccines, the vaccines can remain viable, totally desiccated, ready to travel. They can be unrefrigerated, which is essential for getting to so many parts of the world where vaccines are necessary, but where refrigerators are decidedly scarce. They can lie in that state for months on end. So a truly remarkable medical breakthrough based upon the biology of seeds. But of course, as every gardener knows, some seeds can last a lot longer than a few months. Which does invite an obvious question. How long can a seed survive? How long can a seed lie dormant and still germinate? Now, the answer to that question, at least the current answer, the current record holder, is an incredible story, and it comes to us from a place called Masada. And if any of you happen to miss the Peter O'Toole miniseries, Masada is an ancient fortress that's found on the shores of the Dead Sea, sits atop this rocky crag you can see in the picture here. It was a site famous for this long siege during the Great Revolt, where a band of Jewish rebels held out in that hilltop forest for months upon end against a full Roman legion that was gathered around the base. And if you look in that picture, you see sort of a sloping area on the right-hand side of the crag, and that is an earthen ramp that the Romans built, still visible today, all the way to the top, which was the only way they could figure out how to get up this bloody thing and attack the rebels. And when they got to the top, after months of work, and they breached the walls of the fortress, they found an eerie silence, because the rebels inside had chosen to commit mass suicide rather than surrender to their foes. So as you can imagine, this is a very important cultural site in modern day Israel, and it has been thoroughly excavated in a series of archaeological digs over the years, beginning in the 1960s. And they found weapons, they found coins, they found storehouses still full of food with earthenware pots where you could get residue of olive oil and all of these other things. And in amongst those storehouses, they found a huge trove of date pits. So well preserved in that dry desert air that there were still bits of date flesh stuck to some of these seeds. Truly remarkable. And this was a big deal because these were, of course, Judean dates, which is a variety of date that had disappeared. Famous in the ancient world, they're mentioned in the Bible. They were reportedly required to be upon the breakfast table of the Emperor Augustus. They were famous throughout the ancient world. They were the cash crop, the key cash crop of Herod's kingdom. But after that kingdom fell, they fell out of favor. People stopped growing them, and they had completely disappeared. People thought that they were extinct. So here they were, Judean dates in this archaeological site. So being good archaeologists, of course, they wrote numbers on all of these seeds, and they stuck them in a drawer in a museum in Tel Aviv, and there they sat until about 10 years ago, when some botanists got a hold of some of them and decided it would be fun to plant them, and they did. And sure enough, one of those seeds sprouted into a healthy Judean date after lying dormant there at Masada for 2,000 years. So a truly remarkable record of endurance there given us by this date. Of course, and then there is a picture of Methuselah. They named him Methuselah, and it is a him. The sexes, so to speak, are separate in the date palms. And they madly then began trying to sprout every other ancient Judean date they could find to get a female tree to see if they could truly resurrect this ancient biblical fruit. And I'm pleased to report that just within the last 6 months, they finally published a paper. After trying a number of different seeds, they were indeed able to get a female. And this, what you see before you, is the first harvest of Judean dates in over a millennia. And the researchers who have been behind this effort were incredibly pleased because it turns out they are in fact delicious. They said that we would have felt like fools if we'd spent a decade trying to do this, and it turned out they were crummy. But in fact, the Judean date lived up to its reputation. So truly a remarkable symbol of endurance and mystery, and hardly the only fabulous story of endurance out there. Now, the director of our national seed bank, which is in Fort Collins, Colorado, in a wonderful facility, is named Chris Walters. And she knows more about dormant seeds than anyone I can think of. Because after all, she's taken care of 2 billion of them there at the seed bank. So she knows their habits well. And she told me something truly remarkable when I spent a time with her there at the seed bank. She told me that a truly dormant seed has no measurable metabolic activity. No measurable metabolic activity. And I looked at her and I said, in biology, we have a word for things with no metabolism. We call them dead. And she said something right back to me that I had to write down because it was so perfect. She said, well, if we know of living things that aren't metabolizing, then maybe we need to change our definition of what it means to be alive. So the biology of something as common as a seed can challenge our very notion of life itself. And dormancy is just one of their many amazing traits. As plant enthusiasts, you all have your own seed stories, I'm sure. We could all spend the whole evening, I'm sure, many evenings together telling seed stories. But I will leave that up to you on your own recognizance, and just close out the seed portion of our talk tonight with a quotation from George Bernard Shaw, which I think captures so much about the wonder of seeds. He wrote this in 1918. Think of the fierce energy concentrated in an acorn. You bury it in the ground and it explodes into a giant oak. Bury a sheep and nothing happens but decay. So I think he really captured the wonder of seeds in that great quotation. Now, bees, of course, are another essential backyard wonder. We have lots of bumblebees. We have longhorn bees on the wing here. We have minor bees coming out, our mason bees, and you probably are seeing the same thing in your neck of the woods, particularly with this warm weather we've had. It's just brought a huge flush of bees into our yards. And bees are something too that I've written about and I've been thinking about for a long time, in part because of a story that I heard years ago. One that I think says not only a lot about bees, but a lot about the human relationship to nature. In the mid-1990s, I worked on a mountain gorilla project in a place called Bwindi Impenetrable National Park in southwestern Uganda. And since that time, I have learned that people will actually get mad at me. They'll get angry if I don't include at least one picture of a baby gorilla in every presentation that I make. So here's tonight's baby gorilla. But in addition to baby gorillas, there were all sorts of things happening there. The job involved a lot of trekking through the forest, as you can imagine. And the weather was hot and we were sweaty. And we were often set upon by hordes of these tiny little flies. At least I thought they were flies until I bothered to look closely. And I realized that they were actually tiny jet black little bees, no bigger than a pencil point, attracted to that salty moisture of our sweat. Then the forest held at least a dozen different species of these gentle creatures. They are stingless bees, totally harmless and quite wonderful. Well, a Ugandan graduate student named Vincent came down from the capital city and stayed with us in the park where I worked for several months. And he had arrived to do his master's thesis on these stingless bees. But after a couple of weeks, he was just tearing his hair out because part of his study required finding nests, and he had not found a single nest in all that time. He could find the bees, but he could not find any nests. You could see his whole thesis sort of fizzling out in front of his eyes. And the guides and trackers that I worked with there suggested that he go and talk to the Batwa, a tribe that had lived very intimately in that forest until quite recently and were wonderful in their knowledge of the forest. So he did. He went and he hired a Batwa man as a guide for a day. And later he told me this story that they set off in the morning, just walked into the woods, came to a clearing in the forest, and they sat down next to some flowers. And they waited. And they waited. And he was just starting to think to himself, what am I paying this guy for? When finally a bee showed up and landed on the flower, and then it buzzed off. And they waited again. They waited, and the bee came back. And this happened over and over again, several iterations of this. And then without a word, the man just stood up, said, we go. And off they went into the forest. And they walked through the vines and the part of the vegetation and went on for a few minutes. And then the guy slowed down and he started looking around and he pointed to a stump. And there were the bees coming in and out of this old rotten stump. And Vincent said he was just floored. He was just amazed. How did the guy do it? Well, he knew what kind of flowers these bees were likely to visit. So he knew where to sit and wait. And he knew what direction the bees were going because he watched them make several round trips, and he knew how long it took them to make a round trip. And since everybody knows how fast a stingless bee flies, he knew how far to walk. And he knew that that species nested in rotten logs and stumps. So all he had to do was walk in the right direction for the right amount of time and then stop and look, and there they were. Piece of cake. That, ever since, has been the bar that I aspire to as a naturalist, one that I will never reach. Tracking bees in a rainforest. Unbelievable. But I think that it says a lot about our relationship to nature, right? Because that is our history in a very real sense. There is a lot more tracking in our history than texting. So I do believe that when we learn about nature, it's not only an exploration, it truly is an act of remembrance. And remembering bees is particularly important these days, isn't it? Remembering bees is important because we've all seen the headlines. We've read the news stories about everything from murder hornets to honeybee colonies collapsing en masse to the widespread declines of many native species as well. But in reading those stories, I have often noticed a certain, shall we say, mushiness about the subject matter. I mean, what do we really know about bees? Even experts often stumble over the details. I was once driving in my car listening to the radio, and they were interviewing a very noted historian of science who said that when the early settlers arrived in North America from Europe, they brought with them the honeybees, which is true. The honeybee is native to Europe, and Africa is not a North American species. That part was true, but then he went on to say if they hadn't brought them with them, there would have been nothing here to pollinate their crops. At which point I nearly drove off the road. What about the 4,000 species of native bees already buzzing happily around this continent? I couldn't believe it. But that's not the worst of it. Given my interests, it won't surprise you to learn that I keep a copy of the book, The Bees of the World, on the shelf in my office. And it is a nice hardbound book from a good publisher written by two excellent entomologists. It has a great cover picture on the front, close-up color picture of a fly. A fly on the cover of Bees of the World. What have we come to? So here in the 21st century, we find ourselves in the odd position of being more familiar with the plight of bees from what we read in the news than we tend to be with the bees themselves, which means that the place to start in any exploration of bees is right at the beginning with the most basic question of all: what is a bee? And happily, I have an answer to share with you this evening that I think is short and memorable, and it really does sum up all of the key steps of bee evolution. A bee is a hippie wasp. A hippie wasp. Now, the first thing to remember is that wasps came first. Wasps had been buzzing happily around this planet for millions of years before the bees came along. Bees evolved from the wasps, and they still look quite a lot like them, which is why the two groups are so often confused. But if you ever find yourself being harassed at a picnic, and you notice that your attackers are swarming around the steaks and the fried chicken, and they're trying to steal bits of bologna from your sandwiches, then don't blame bees. In that situation, your adversaries are most certainly wasps, because the wasps are carnivores and scavengers. They're constantly out searching the landscape for protein, bits of fleshy material that they can take back home to feed to their offspring. They hunt spiders and they hunt other insects, and they will happily scavenge sandwich meat on the same foraging trip. Bees evolved from the wasps by changing their diet. The key evolutionary step that led to bees was a dietary shift. They shifted away from that hunting lifestyle and learned to provision themselves and their offspring solely from the products of flowers. And once they had made that dietary switch, their habits, their lifestyle, their bodies even began to evolve as a consequence of that. They evolved these long tube-like tongues for sipping nectar from deep flower tubes. They evolved these very distinctive, almost feather-like branched hairs that you can see in the picture there that are adapted to effectively carry pollen from the flowers back home to the nest. So all of these steps that changed the bees and really made them what they are. And it boils down to that hippie wasp analogy, and that you can just remember them as the long-haired, flower-loving vegetarians of the Hymenoptera. They are the hippies, the hippie wasps. And all of this occurred a long time ago, which brings us to these dinosaurs. We know that the bees evolved from the wasps during the mid-Cretaceous period, which was famously dominated by these big lumbering beasts. But if you can look beyond them for a minute, you'll notice something interesting. Conifers and ferns abounded in that landscape. But where are the flowers? Where are the flowers? You have to look pretty hard in that picture to find a couple of shrubs that might be able to produce a flower. But flowers were a rarity. The artist got it just right. In that landscape at that time, flowers were bit players in a landscape, in a flora that was still dominated by early seed plants, like cycads and all sorts of things. Still had a huge array of spore plants in the flora as well. And the flowering plants were bit players, less than 5% an estimated part of that flora. So in that regard, switching over to flowers for your nutrition was a pretty bold move for these early bees. And in fact, it was part of quite a mystery that challenged the thinking of a lot of early naturalists, in that mid-Cretaceous period, the flowering plants, which had been sort of trickling along as nothing, suddenly exploded in abundance and in diversity. Charles Darwin and other naturalists of the day were very familiar with the emerging fossil record, and you would see it very clearly in the rocks. There were no flowering plants, no flowering plants, no flowering plants, mid-Cretaceous, flowering plants everywhere. Not only common, but very diverse at the same time. Darwin famously called this an abominable mystery, and he considered it one of the chief challenges, if you will, threats to his notion of evolution as a slow and incremental process. But what's rarely mentioned is that in the same letter to his friend, the botanist Hooker, where he made that comment about this abominable mystery of these flowering plants, he mentioned that he had been corresponding with another naturalist of the day, a lesser known naturalist named Gaston de Saporta, a Frenchman. And Saporta had written to Darwin with his theory that in fact the flowering plants had evolved rapidly in the mid-Cretaceous because of their interactions with insects, particularly the bees. And Saporta tried to convince Darwin that this is what had happened. And in fact, evolution could be that fast when you had these two major groups interacting in that way. Well, Darwin didn't buy it. He didn't buy it. He preferred to think that the flowering plants must have evolved slowly and incrementally someplace else, and then dispersed rapidly to the places where they became fossilized. Of course, Darwin was more famous. As you can see, he also had a bigger beard, and I think that counted for something in Victorian times. So his thinking really prevailed for decades, and it wasn't until the turn of the century, early 20th century, when pollination biology really started to take off, that people realized old Saporta had been right all along, and that the rapid diversification of flowering plants arose in a co-evolutionary setting with the flower visiting insects, particularly the bees. And the results, of course, are visible not only overall in the flora, we're now 95%, 95% of our flora is made up of flowering plants, but also just the diversity and the sheer wonder of the flowers, visible everywhere from Washington Park and its lovely mimulus meadows to the nearest flower market. Truly a remarkable diversity of flowers as a result of the relationship with bees. But I think what is less well known and less appreciated is how that diversity of flowering plants led in turn to a wonderful diversity of bees, which range from the familiar, like this bumblebee, to the downright fantastic, like this iridescent green sweat bee, which you can see in your backyard in Bellingham. I will have you know that species is local, to the downright strange, like this long-tongued specimen found only in the Atacama Desert of Chile. They can be minuscule, like this little cuckoo bee adhered to the side of a collecting pin, and they can be massive, like this wonderful oil collecting bee native to Puerto Rico. Now their colors range from simple, like this leaf cutter. They can be showy, this red top bee. They can even be fabulous and blue, like this blue banded bee from Australia, or this euglossine bee, a wonderful purple euglossine from French Guiana. And while it's true that many bees are fuzzy, like this longhorn bee, they can also be smooth, like this blood bee, or this wonderful euglossine bee from Central America, an orchid bee, if you will. Yeah, and so some bees do seem alarming. I would admit at least certain parts of them can be alarming. It's also true that despite their faceted eyes and mandibles and so forth, they can be what can only be described as cute, like this hairy-eyed bee from Argentina, a brand new species, by the way. I'm not even sure if it has an officially recognized name yet. So the co-evolution of bees and flowering plants has led to great diversity on both sides of that equation. A full 20,000 species of bees can be found buzzing around this planet, more than all the birds and the mammals put together. You can even throw in the snakes. And only a tiny fraction of those bees have ever been studied in any detail. Perhaps thousands of species are yet to be described. It is entirely possible, perhaps even likely, that sitting here, scattered as we are, around the Pacific Northwest, which is a well-studied landscape by any measure, we are most likely, all of us, within a few miles of a bee unknown to science. How thrilling. So if I had given this presentation 100 years ago, I would stop now and take your questions. Even 50 years ago, I probably wouldn't need to say another word. But in the 21st century, it is impossible to talk about natural wonders without confronting also the challenges, the many challenges that they face. Because just as many bee populations are in decline, so too, of course, are many plant populations and the seeds that they produce. In some cases, so too are the very relationships that connect bees and plants in the first place. I have a book coming out later this year on the biology of climate change, and it features, among other stories, this pair here, one of my favorite local pairs, if you will, dance partners for all time, Death Camas, and the only bee known to pollinate it, the very appropriately named Death Camas bee. Only the Death Camas bee has figured out the trick of detoxifying the nectar and pollen found on Death Camas. Unlike most toxic plants, which focus their poisons in roots or in seeds or in leaves and other things likely to be gnawed by insects, Death Camas is generous with it. It puts it everywhere. Even the pollen and nectar are poisonous, and only this bee has figured out that trick of making them a safe meal from this very deadly plant. And of course, that means that the two species are linked in a very tight and very specialized relationship. But what happens now? That Death Camas, here in the San Juan Islands at least, now blooms a full 2 weeks earlier than it did just 30 years ago, responding to the warmer springs, as we're all experiencing now in these recent warm days. As the air temperatures warm, that triggers an earlier bloom of Death Camas. But the bee nests in the ground. It is a mining bee, and the ground temperatures are warming at a slower rate. So the bee remains mostly on the old schedule, which is a situation that biologists call a potential timing mismatch, where these two species, these two intricately linked species, are now threatened with being pulled apart, not in space, but in time. So these threats to specialized pollinators and the plants they are interacting with are very real, and there are many other threats associated, not just with climate change, but with habitat loss and various other challenges that we have presented to our natural wonders. But I believe that makes it all the more critical for us to revitalize our connections to nature in a variety of ways every day, because I think that our resolve gains strength through wonder. And I do believe strongly that we are better able to meet these challenges when we approach them, not from a standpoint of despair, but from one of fascination. Despair leads to despair. Fascination and curiosity lead to action. So I would like to conclude then this evening with a short passage that comes to us from the preface to Buzz. From the beginning, it's of course about bees, but I think the message is true for seeds or any other backyard wonder. And I think it is probably appropriate for us to always end at the start, because we're still just beginning to understand the biology of these things. We're still just beginning to understand their importance to our own lives and history. And we're really just at the start of doing what we can to help them. This then from the preface to Buzz, which begins with an epigraph from Henry David Thoreau, who wrote, "There are certain pursuits which, if not wholly poetic and true, do at least suggest a nobler and finer relation to nature than the one we know. The keeping of bees, for instance, is like directing the sunbeams. Bees today certainly need our help, but just as importantly, they need our curiosity. Exploring the history and biology of these essential creatures can transform anyone into an enthusiast, and that is the purpose of this book. But I hope you will do more than read it. I hope it makes you want to go straight outside on the next sunny day, find a bee on a flower, and settle down to watch. If you do, you might just find yourself daring to reach out and catch that bee, the same way that my young son has done since the age of 3, barehanded. Try this, and you too can feel the tickle of tiny feet and the whispery rustle of wings on your palm before you slowly part your fingers, hold the bee up, and set it free." Thank you all very much for your Zoom attention this evening. I think Jim is going to facilitate if there are any questions you may have at this time.
Yes, thank you, Tor. That was fantastic. Anyone has any questions, please go ahead and type them into the Q&A or the chat, either one works. I'll start with a question. Thor, how long have you been studying bees locally?
Oh, locally. That's a good question. Let's see. My interest in bees really dates back to graduate school, which was not a local experience, but I got fascinated because I was studying the pollination and population genetics of large rainforest trees in Central America. And because I fingerprinted genetically all these adult trees in the landscape, I could track how their pollen was moving. And I knew that something out of sight up there in the rainforest canopy was moving bees, not just between and among neighboring trees, but between trees that were 1.5 miles apart. And because the species of tree I was studying is a big legume and had these big purple pea flowers, just like the pea flowers back home, I knew that that something had to be bees. So I coerced a friend of mine, an entomologist, into joining me for a couple of extremely fruitless weeks of raising all manner of insect traps into the canopy and catching a grand total of 0 bees. It was a complete flop scientifically, and I never did learn what species, or probably several species, were doing the hard work of all that pollination. But it really set off this fascination within me that has never rested. And now I look for chances to study bees wherever I can. And so locally, that would date back, almost 20 years now, probably, to a variety of bees, not just our wonderful local death camas bee, but a particular fascination with bees in the Anthophora genus, the digger bees that nest in sandy bluffs and cliffs here in the San Juan Islands, and of course on the mainland and other places too. And some truly remarkable aggregations of hundreds of thousands of these bees all nesting together. So a great interest in a variety of our local fauna. We still don't even have a good bee list for this neck of the woods. We're still working on it. Still a lot to learn.
Yeah, absolutely. Abe and Katrina are asking if there are more examples of bees that have relationships with just one plant, like the death bee and the death camas.
Great question. So the scientific term for it is oligolectic, meaning a diet of few, limited diet, so to speak. And there are a number of bees that follow that path. Over time, specialization can lead to a wonderful niche. We see that particularly in climates and places where things have been stable for a long time. So you see a lot of speciality in tropical rainforests and various other places where specialists really reign. It is a troubling and problematic strategy when things start to change rapidly, which is why we're so worried now about these specialist bees and other specialists too. If you follow the fate of our local orca populations, and biology now tells us that orcas have specialized over thousands of years to be the world's greatest king salmon fishers, right? They will go through a whole school of salmon picking out the Chinook. But now that Chinook are becoming increasingly scarce, of course, that specialty is a disadvantage. So we see a lot of examples then in the bee world of specialists, and those are the ones that are setting off alarm bells now in terms of climate change.
Yeah. Heather Scott's asking, what is the best and easiest resource to start identifying our local bees?
Yes. Oh, well, first, the best resource is time. You've got to be able to sit out there and really get a look at these things. You can start really having a lot of fun with some of the easier ones to identify, which would be the bumblebees. We have a suite of native bumblebees. There are at least a dozen here in the San Juan Islands, even a few more over in your neck of the woods. You can go up into the mountains on the mainland and see even more. There are 250 species of bumblebees in the world to choose from. So it's quite a diverse group and quite diverse locally. And they're one of the groups that you can identify from coloration, not completely, but more often than with some of these smaller bees, which are more of a challenge to ID. So there are several resources out there. There's the Bumblebees of North America, which is a good book. There's also a Bumblebee Guide to the Bumblebees of Western North America, which is published by the Forest Service. Excellent little book. It's available online. If you Google it, you can download the PDF and then print it out. And it shows you a lot of the color patterns that you can look for in the bumblebees. So they're a great way to start. And they're also very gentle creatures, as most of these native bees are. So you can watch them. It's possible to pet a bumblebee. If you learn, of course, to tell the difference between the males and the females, you can even catch them in your hand because, of course, with all the hymenopterans, it is the females that have the stingers, not the males, because the stinger is evolved from the ovipositor, the egg-laying device. So as feisty as a male may be, he will never sting you because he simply doesn't have the plumbing or the hardware. So that is a great way to get started, is with bumblebees. The patient things to watch, you can even catch them in little clear tubes and get a better look at them before you release them again. So that's a really wonderful place to start. There's also a book, is it called Identifying Bees in Your Backyard? Came out a couple of years ago, written by someone here in the Pacific Northwest, it seems to me. And I'm blanking on the name, but if you look for a book of a title similar to that, you'll get this recent edition that has wonderful pictures, good introduction to the many other kinds of bees, from leafcutters to masons to miners to cuckoo bees and so forth. And it'll give you basic types to look for, and you'll find them. Getting them down to genus and species takes a lot more work, usually specimens in a microscope and and a career. But at any rate, nonetheless, you can get those major groups in your brain and start seeing a lot of them in the same places where you're looking for bumblebees.
That's a good lead into Josh Schupak's question, which is any tips or cautions for catching bees in your hands? You mentioned a few already.
Yes, yeah, definitely learn to tell the males and then you're all set. And also many of these smaller bees, their sting is mild or non-existent. There's a huge group of bees out here, including the death camas bee, where the stinger is reduced to non-existent. The andrenids hardly sting. Some of them don't even have the equipment at all anymore. They're really, really gentle creatures. So you have some basically stingless andrenids that you can catch easily and with confidence. Even a lot of the little sweat bees, the little halictids, I mean, they'll sting you, and it just warms your heart because it's such a good effort, and it just feels like a pin. But God bless him for trying. So there are some of these bees that are quite gentle. The ones you have to be a little more cautious of are the social bees, the highly social bees, which in our neck of the woods really are the honeybees, which are around in good numbers. And also then the bumblebees, the females, will sting. They're pretty gentle, but they will sting if you trap them against your palm or something that you can expect a sting from them, and it's a good wallop. And the social bees are the ones that have the strong stingers because, of course, they have more to defend. We see strong stings generally evolve in these groups where there's a larger nest, where there is a great storage then of food resources, be it honey and pollen and so forth, stored in those nests, a lot of larvae developing there, a lot of sister bees working in and out of that nest, even more so, of course, with the honeybees, but certainly for bumblebees as well. They have a lot to defend, and so they're more likely to have a fierce sting. The vast majority of our bees locally, and anywhere in the world really, are solitary bees. They may nest in aggregations where the habitat brings them together, but each individual female is provisioning her own nest on her own. And so in that situation, the easiest thing to do if she's harassed is to flee rather than try to defend what is only 4, 5, 6 little cells in a hole in the ground or in a stick or something. So those solitary bees have very gentle stings if they sting at all.
Anyone else have any questions? Please put them into the Q&A or chat. Let's see. There's some in the chat. Bees in Your Backyard is the name of the book you were mentioning, according to Kimberly Sims.
That's it. Thank you, Kimberly. Yes, I knew it was something like that.
Marianne points out that OSU has a free insect ID service. They were able to ID a tiny sweat bee that I had in my yard in the thousands. Kimberly Sims is asking what was the habitat in your yard that attracted so many sweat bees?
Oh, the sweat bees that we have quite a variety, but if you're trying to get more bees in your yard, the ground nesters really like a path, turns out, a dirt path. So you'll find them nesting in places where the dirt is clear of vegetation and trampled to some degree. And there are various iterations of that. But for example, I was playing badminton with my son yesterday, and he gave me the side with the Endangered nesting colony, because he knew that I would be so distracted trying not to step on all these little bee nests that he would win. And of course he did win. So if you have trampled ground, if you like to play badminton, that's a good place to look. Pathways that are dirt paths are good places to look. And it's a good reminder to try to think about leaving that sort of habitat available. We have a tendency often in our landscaping to cover things with beauty bark and have it covered up in some way, don't have bare soil. But bare soil can be a very, very popular habitat for a whole range of ground nesting bees. Similarly, if you want, including halictids, there are a lot of sweat bees locally that nest in the ground. Lasioglossum, halictus itself, you'll find them oftentimes in ground nesting situations. And you also want to leave, twigs when you tidy up the garden at the end of the year. Don't put everything in the compost. Leave a lot of those old canes and twigs lying around, and you'll get some small carpenter bees nesting in those. There are, of course, many ways now to encourage mason bees. It's possible to buy mason bees and then release them at your place, but you can also simply put up the nesting habitat, and the mason bees that you already have on your property that you might not have noticed will very often start to use that. So you can find out what's there simply by providing them with cardboard tubes or holes in wood in these various ways. So it's a really rewarding thing to do, to return bees to your yard or to encourage them in your yard, because unlike so many aspects of conservation biology, it really is one where you can experience instant gratification. I recently added some catmint to the bed in front of my office shack there, because I thought I need something that blooming in this particular time of year, and it's not native, but I know the bees love it. And before I could get these plants out of the little pots from the hardware store and get them into the ground, I had 4 species of native bumblebees nectaring on them. So instant gratification is a rare treat in conservation work, and I highly recommend it in the form of making your yard more amenable to bees.
Do you have any advice on going out to observe bees? Are there good times of day, good sort of places to go? Where would you recommend looking for native bees?
Yeah, good question. So there are several recommendations there. One being, if you see a bee and you happen to be wearing a wool jacket, and you've got your wool hat on, probably long johns and that kind of thing, that's the easiest time ever to identify the bee. You know it is a bumblebee because they are the ones that are adapted to flying in cold weather around here. Bumblebees have this great ability, and some other bees do, but bumblebees are the champs with all that great fuzz as well. They can detach the wings from the wing muscles and then vibrate the wing muscles to generate body heat. So they bring themselves up to flight temperature, even on cold mornings, cold evenings, or cold early spring days when you will not see any other bees flying. And this big lumbering beast goes by, and you've just heard or seen or both one of our local Bombus species. So that is a good tip for seeing the early bumbles. But really, to see a variety of native bees, there are a couple of approaches. You can go, again, in the springtime now to really great nectar sources, and you're going to see some stuff. You're going to see generalists. You're going to see those bumblebees. There are some of the mason bees that use a variety of flowers. And this is going to, I mean, you can go to a roadside heather meadow where, there's a place on San Juan where the road crew, for whatever reason, planted a non-native heather. But the bees love it, and it's thriving with bees. What you won't see there, though, are a lot of the more specialized bees, the ones that are particular to suites of plants and groups of plants. So in that situation, your best bet is to go to a place with good native wildflowers. The greater the native diversity that you have, if it's in a wildflower meadow or if you're planting for your backyard, including local wildflowers or at least regional wildflowers, is really going to boost your bee diversity, because there are whole suites of bees, and in addition to particular species that zero in on a particular plant, there are groups of bees or genera that will focus on groups of plants. And so if you have these local plants, you're going to have local bees. They're out there looking, and they will find them. It is truly remarkable. So any place that you have good flower diversity, you're going to attract a lot of bees.
I wonder if do social bees tend to be generalists, and non-social bees tend to be reliant on specific plants, or is that not true?
That's a great question. Yeah, most of the social bees will be more likely to be generalists. Bumblebees, honeybees, for example, in that they have these massive colonies, right, that they're trying to support. And so they've got to be, widespread in their efforts. Whereas a lot of the more specialized bees, native bees, have shorter flight periods. It's a single female doing her own thing. They're more likely to specialize. All that said, though, there are a lot of generalist bees in that category as well. Both approaches, have pluses or cons in different situations. So you will see, solitary bees that are also very Catholic in their tastes for a variety of flowers, as well as the specialists.
Yeah. Annalise Burns asking, how important are native plants versus ornamental plants to bees?
Very important, very important. Again, you can have a mix in your garden, but you always, if you get the chance to include more natives regionally or locally, you're going to get a greater mix of bees and a greater mix of all sorts of things, because we have so many, we're not talking about moths this evening, for example, but nonetheless, you have these relationships between the Lepidoptera, the moths and butterflies in particular, host plants, and they're not familiar with ornamentals. So the same thing can go then with bees. The generalists will see a flower and they'll investigate it. The specialists have particular tastes, and if it doesn't look right, they stay clear. So again, natives are important. You can do a lot with non-natives too. A mix will get you through the season. The lucky thing about bee gardening is that the sort of flower garden that appeals to us also tends to appeal to bees, and that we want to see blooms spring through summer. Well, so do the bees, right? So if you can plan a garden that does provide pollen and nectar throughout the season, it's another good way to ensure you have a variety of bees, because different groups come out at different times.
Yeah. Heather Scott is asking if you have any native plants in your yard that are specifically for an endangered bee or bee species.
We have a lot of different natives out there, not one for a specific bee. I try to include a range. I don't have death camas in the yard, although I thought of trying to get some going because I want to see if this bee will find it. I have a feeling it will. I'm only about a mile from a known colony of death camas bee, but I don't have any yet. That would be the one, if I were to do it, that's what I would start with. It's a pretty hardy plant if you get the right spot for it. And I'd love to see if the death camas bee would find it.
How far do bees, especially the native bees, how far do they range when foraging?
For most species, we don't know, but they tend to be, well, a lot of them are extremely small, And so their flight paths, flight distance is thought to be smaller than some of these large, robust bees. I mean, you can be out on the salt chuck here in the Pacific Northwest and see a bumblebee go flying by offshore. I'm like, where on earth are they going? Well, they have a plan. They're going someplace. You probably would be less likely to see a little mining bee or a cuckoo bee out there taking that kind of a flight. So it's thought that they are more focused. And I can think of examples, where we have small islands here in the San Juans, little islets, if you will, rocks with just a bit of soil and a few plants, and bees that would appear to mostly just stay and forage on those tiny little 2-acre plots, at least in some cases. So again, for most species, we don't have numbers on it, but size and habit suggest smaller ranges than honeybees or bumblebees, which really do fly long distances.
Yeah. All right. Abe and Katrina are asking if honeybees pose any risks to native bees.
Sure, yeah, they do. In a couple of ways. There's concern about disease transmission from honeybees to native bees. This has been documented now. And since with a domestic honeybee, we transport them long distances. You can order bees through the mail and they come this way and that, and we transport them for commercial pollination, which is essential. And they're, in many cases, very well cared for by the beekeepers as well as they can, but that's a tough lifestyle, and it moves them long distances where diseases are likely, if they were present, to travel with them. And we do see some instances then of disease transmission from domestic bees out into the wild. And that's a concern because once that genie is out of the bottle, you can't go out and vaccinate your little mining bees. So we do worry about that. And then the second thing, and this is one that varies with circumstance, is how honeybees impact native bees in terms of competition for resources, because they're after, the honeybee is such a generalist, and they'll get out there on any flower they find, and they're prolific, living in colonies of thousands. So if you do keep bees, one of the things to remember is that if you're starting a new hive of bees, you're bringing in thousands of hungry bees to your backyard. So you want to make sure you're planting a lot of flowers at the same time, because they're going to be hungry. If we provide more habitat for the honeybees, and the local bees will use it too. So that we need to make sure we're making that connection. Most of the time, the big concern that I hear from native bee specialists has to do with habitats where resources are limited and where time is short. And what happens often in the later parts of the summer is that the agricultural season is finished. And so all of these honeybees that have been moved from crop to crop and so on, they need to be, if you will, pastured. They need a place to go. And so there's a tradition of often going up into the mountains and pasturing honeybees up there, because they can feed on this variety of wildflowers that are then coming into bloom in the mountains. And that's a situation where I know there's some real concern from native bee specialists, because the flower resources there are short duration and limited. And if you're introducing, thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of competitors into that environment, some people have run the numbers on what that means for the native bees, and it means in those situations that the resources can run scarce. So that is one example I know of where there's some real concern, and I believe the Forest Service is now starting to develop better guidelines for that pasturing process and how many bees can be in the alpine and where they go and that sort of thing.
Does anyone do any beekeeping of native bees, other than building boxes and things like that, for wild bees to?
Yeah, good question. Beekeeping options. Well, certainly people are working a lot with mason bees, and leafcutter bees now are also being used domestically. Some local bees. One of the more fascinating native bees that is being, partially domesticated, if you will, is the Alkali Bee, which is a beautiful little bee with pearly opalescent stripes that's native to the dry interior landscapes here in the Pacific Northwest, throughout the West. They nest in salt pan areas, and they're wonderful pollinators, it turns out, for alfalfa. So if you go over to the Tushi Valley here in Washington, at the right time of year and turn off your car, the air is humming. You can just hear the hum of these bees. And it is a place where they have specialized now for generations in raising alfalfa for seed. And if you want alfalfa for seed, they must, of course, have good pollination. And they learned that this native bee does a great job pollinating alfalfa, better than honeybees, better than leaf cutters. They bring in leaf cutters too. But what they do are develop these bee beds where they mimic the alkali flats where the bees nest. And it's one of the only places perhaps anywhere that you will see farmers purposely salting their fields. But they get these huge trucks full of rock salt and they put a layer of crust over a field. They have it sub-irrigated at just the right way. They've been working on this technique for years. And when they build that habitat, the bees colonize it immediately. And so they have built up this incredible population of native alkali bees there. I mean, the last time anyone tried to count, and this is old data, it was 27 to 30 million bees in that valley, alkali bees. And that's an underestimate because it wasn't even including some of the population. So, and it's grown since then. So at any rate, there are some very interesting examples of working with other types of bees for pollination, less so for honey production. You have to look a little farther afield there. The honey-making bees, again, are the highly social bees, honeybees, of which there are 11 or so species. But then there are 600 to 800 species of stingless bees in the tropics, the ones I mentioned earlier, which are also highly social, and they are honey makers. And there are a few cases of where those have also been domesticated, the most famous being the Mayan people domesticated the royal queen from the rainforests there. And there are still a few Mayan beekeepers still using that stingless bee there for honey production. But most of the beekeeping for honey are Western honeybee or similar species in Asia.
All right, any other questions? Going once, going twice. All right, well, I think that might be it.
Terrific.
Thank you, Thor.
My pleasure. Thanks to all of you. Happy spring, happy plant hunting, and keep your eyes peeled for those bees when you're out there on your flower walks. They'll be there. Thanks. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
All right. So everyone else, we will do our usual post-meeting get together. So just sort of hang around for a bit and you'll be invited to join the panel for our informal discussion.
All right, we'd be glad to hear from anybody, local or